Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litwak, the Center's Vice President for Programs and Director of International Security Studies, and along with the Director of the Middle East Program, Haleh Esfandiari, and I would like to thank Paulo for really taking the lead within the Wilson Center and organizing today's conference on the May 2010 Brazil-Turkey nuclear initiative toward Iran. We just had an excellent opening session with perspectives from Brazil and Turkey in the broader context of shifting power alignments in the international system and the new roles that rising powers are playing in that system. We shift now to perspectives from a broader set of countries beyond the immediate participants in that trilateral diplomacy. We'll look at it from Iran's perspective, Arab countries, and the United States. We will go in the order as on the program. The biographies have been distributed, so I will leave those to you to kind of read more about each of the speakers. Before turning the floor over to Ambassador Craig Kelly of the Cohen Group, who will lead off, I would ask anyone who is sitting in the rear, you're welcome to move forward. There is seating available. Ambassador Kelly will open up. Then we'll turn to Trita Parsi, who's president of the National Iranian American Council. He's a former Woodrow Wilson Center public policy scholar. And then finally, we'll have Professor Nizar Messari. He's a professor of international relations at the Al-Waqfain University in Morocco. So with that, Ambassador Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Paulo, muito obrigado pelo convite. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation to share thoughts with you this morning, and compliments to the early panel, Dr. Hertz and Professor Kibaroglu. I thought that was a really interesting presentation. To hear Professor Kibaroglu speak about Ankara, it made me realize that of the three countries, main countries we're talking about, Brazil, Turkey, and the United States, there are many people in all three countries who think that there are cities outside the capital that have more charms than the capital city. So that's one thing that we share. On the question of the Palestinians, as my good friend Ambassador Portales knows, actually the large Palestinian community in South America is in Chile, 300,000 people, which is a very interesting element of the historic mix of Chile's population. But since you raised that, I thought I would add that point. Paulo asked me to speak a bit about the U.S. role throughout this whole process, and so I'd like to begin by clarifying what the U.S. view and role was not. The U.S. stance was not ever to discourage Brazil or Turkey from trying to exert influence on this issue or other issues around the world. I think it's very important to underscore. I can speak more credibly about the Brazil case because at the time I was working at the State Department on Western Hemisphere affairs, and the fact is that as U.S. policy in Latin America and the Caribbean has evolved over the years, I think we've made very clear that the Monroe Doctrine is dead, that we actually welcome the increased globalization of countries in our own hemisphere out of the strong conviction that that increasing internationalization, whether it's through trade or cultural exchange or participation in peacekeeping operations, is profoundly in the U.S. interest, and it's something we've actually encouraged. So I think it is important to stress that whatever differences we may have had on the substance, which were real, and I'll touch on those, the whole episode of last year was not born of a desire to discourage exercise of influence by the two countries. And in fact, it would have been particularly strange for us to do so, given the important roles that both Turkey and Brazil play in areas of profound interest to the United States. And I can simply cite the case of Haiti, where an issue which is of extraordinary importance to the Obama administration and to Secretary Clinton personally, the fact that Brazil leads the MINUSTA, the so-called MINUSTA UN peacekeeping operation in Haiti, is just one of many, many examples where we actually welcome Brazil's increasing role. But in this particular episode, I think it's also important to stress that no one, I think, in the United States administration questioned the commitment of Brazil or Turkey to the overall goal, which was to make sure that there was not a nuclear weapons program developed in Iran. Now, that's where the similarities perhaps began to diminish, because there were real differences on how we went about this. And in the U.S. case, President Obama and Secretary Clinton felt that the United States had made every effort, with the assumption of power of President Obama, to reach out to Iran. The famous speech by President Obama and several diplomatic initiatives to try to show that we wanted to pursue this issue and many other issues through a spirit of dialogue. And that only when that failed to bear fruit, and to the contrary, bore a lot of frustration, did the United States come to the conclusion that only by a combination of diplomacy and pressures to be achieved through the United Nations Security Council in the form of sanctions were we likely to see progress on an issue that is important to many, many countries around the world. And this went hand in hand with a profound skepticism about Iran's true goals, something that was, shared widely throughout the U.S. administration. In any administration, there's going to be a debate about actual tactics, but the skepticism about Iran's goals was widely shared throughout our administration, and I would argue throughout much of the international community. On the Brazilian side, as we perceived it, because I cannot speak for the Brazilians, but I can speak about how our conversations with the Brazilians unfolded during that time, it was clear that there was a very, very deep-seated skepticism about sanctions in general. Many of our discussions, including with then Ambassador Patriota here in Washington, now, of course, the foreign minister of Brazil, very clear, long conversations about sanctions in various countries, and the acknowledgement that perhaps only in South Africa had sanctions worked in a way that actually achieved positive change. The United States took that as an honest difference on tactics and not some sort of theological difference. The question, as Dr. Hertz has pointed out, about the NPT and how it has developed around the world, including Brazil's position on the additional protocol. Again, those are differences that the United States and Brazil acknowledge. The United States has always pointed out the positive Brazilian disposition of its own nuclear capability, has always cited it as a positive example, and also its performance in signing the Treaty of Tlatelolco and so forth. Again, I think this comes down to not a difference in principle, but a major difference on how to proceed with a program that we were very, very skeptical about. And the White House letter, the famous White House letter, was, as Dr. Hertz has noted, part of the conversation, but it was not the entire conversation. When the letter leaked, the United States felt compelled to make clear publicly as well that this was not the only communication that we had sought through various forms of briefings in Brazil, in the United States, to make clear why we were skeptical. This was not a case of our going around the Persian Gulf looking for an enemy. We felt that we had a solid reason to believe, to be skeptical and to want to pursue the course of sanctions. And therefore, when the Brazil-Turkey effort was underway, we made clear privately and publicly that no one contested the right of Brazil and Turkey to pursue, to explore, but we also made clear that anything that gave the impression that the international community was somehow divided and that Iran could play divide and conquer with the international community would be a concern to us. And so, again, a strong tactical difference, and a real one. I don't want to diminish the difference, and the mood between the two countries was very difficult during that period. I might note that there's a context there that I think has to be taken into consideration of where we were winter and spring of 2010 as well, because it was not only the Iran issue. We had a couple of other things going on, as Paulo well knows. and I was directly involved in a couple of them, so I'm going to cite them. One is the Honduras episode. I became sort of the point person for the U.S. administration on trying to help the Hondurans arrive at an internal accord that later became known as the Tegucigalpa-San Jose Accord. And made several trips to the region, going back and forth between the regime leader, Micheletti, and the deposed President Zelaya, who was in the Brazilian mission in Honduras. So the whole Honduras issue was a very sensitive one in U.S.-Brazil relations, one that we talked about very openly, very directly, but we had certain clear differences, as I think everybody knew. Another element, again, like Honduras, not directly related to Iran, but part of the mood music at that time. And that was the various human rights issues. In February of 2010, I led a delegation to Havana as part of the resumed migration accords, the migration dialogue that President Obama decided to reinitiate after an 8-year lapse. So we met regularly with the Cuban government to talk about migration issues and sort of the ancillary issues that go with that. And these talks take place one time in the United States, then in Havana, United States, Havana, and so forth. So in February was the first time that the talks took place in Havana since their resumption, and ours was the highest level delegation that went to Havana in 15 years. So there was a lot of attention on this. And while we were down there, just apart from the migration-related issues where we spent a day and a half in very detailed talks, we also met, to the government's great chagrin, with various leaders of civil society, including dissidents. This became a big press issue at the time. And we also called privately and publicly for the release of the hunger striker Orlando Zapata, who subsequently died as a result of his detainment. As was widely known at the time, there were certain declarations on the part of President Lula about the efficacy of hunger strikes and so forth that posed sort of a wide distance between the U.S. and the Brazilian position on the Cuba issue in particular, and certain general issues on human rights that Dr. Hertz talked about. So I think it's important to look at this in the context of where we were at the time in our overall relationship with Brazil. But on all three of those issues, there was direct contact and an effort to work through these as friendly countries do, even when they have major differences. And that continued on all three elements. And I think it's important to underscore that as we're now in a new phase of the relationship, a new administration in Brazil, and a determination, I think, on the part of both countries to acknowledge differences, but to continue to work on the many areas where the countries have overlapping interests and overlapping values. And those are in many, many different areas, whether it's international peacekeeping, energy issues, economic reform in Latin America and the Caribbean, the effects of globalization on our economies in the region, biofuels, where we work in third countries together. We have a very important bilateral agreement on fighting racial discrimination, given the somewhat similar histories of our countries in that regard, and a whole host of issues where we continue to work in very, very intense terms with the Brazilians. And it's, I think, important to note as well, as part of that diplomacy, and as our ambassador in Brasilia, Tom Shannon, likes to point out, that diplomacy is much more than connecting governments. It's about connecting whole societies. And this is a major part of what the U.S. administration and what Tom and Brasilia are trying to do to make sure that we have a whole range of programs that connect, our scientists, our students, our business people, our researchers, and so forth. And so the visit of President Obama, when he arrives in Brazil on March 19th, will be an effort to remind the world, I think, of that overarching relationship and the importance that it is to both countries, and we think to the region, and that it should not shock people that countries that have a very friendly, cooperative relationship are going to have some differences, even major differences from time to time, and it's how you deal with those differences that is very important. And this is not to diminish the critical importance of the Iran nuclear issue, which remains, the United States sort of top of the inbox in terms of challenges around the world, but one in which we, the United States, will continue to work as cooperatively as possible with Brazil and, of course, with Turkey. I think the same can be said on that side of the equation as well. As I conclude, I think my time's about up. I do want to underscore important to look at the broad complexity and, in the best sense, of this bilateral relationship, one which we have to keep all of these balls juggling at the same time. To give just a touch of that flavor, as we speak in Sao Paulo, those of you that are baseball fans will appreciate this. Major League Baseball has a team in Sao Paulo training coaches and players from throughout South America, including Brazil, at a baseball stadium in Sao Paulo. Now, who would have thought U.S.-Brazil cooperation in baseball? But it's happening this week as we speak. So this is a very, very broad-ranging relationship. I'm convinced that the administration will know how to continue to frame the disagreements that still exist in certain areas within that broader context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Turn now to Trita Parsi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here today. I want to thank Haleh, Robert, and Paulo for organizing this and inviting me to speak on this very important and interesting topic. I will address a little bit of the perspectives as I read it from the Iranian side, but I would also, mindful of the very interesting panel before, try to address some of those issues because they are, at the end of the day, interlapping. The importance of U.S.-Brazilian relations will, of course, only grow as the foreign policy and profile of Brazil continues to rise. And in the Middle East, the importance of Turkey, particularly mindful of the latest people revolutions against the authoritative governments there take place. The influence of Turkey is unmistaken, in addition to, of course, the leadership that it has shown in the region, its soft power, particularly in the Arab world, and its thus far successful journey towards democracy. At the same time, the new and assertive foreign policy profiles of Turkey or Brazil have fueled the inevitable tensions that arise between great powers and middle powers as the latter seek opportunities to enhance its international profile and the former instinctively resist the weakening of its dominance. Now, though some of these tensions and irritation already existed to a certain extent between the United States and Turkey because of, as one U.S. official described it to me, them being less pliant and more independent states. And I think in the case of Turkey, we have the situation in Iraq. The ambassador just explained some of the situations in Honduras and Cuba, etc. That also shows that the issue of Iran, the issue of some of these tensions, not only preceded the question of the Tehran Declaration, but probably will also continue afterwards as well. But nevertheless, the idea of a rising Turkey and Brazil has become defined in the minds of many in Washington by the Tehran Declaration. For a city that at the time was singularly focused on passing sanctions on Iran because of the perception of failed diplomacy prior to that, the Brazilian-Turkish mediation was seen as interference at best or sabotage at worst. And the critical attitude towards the deal can perhaps be best summed up by the fact that Turkey and Brazil's success in getting Iran to agree to ship out its low-enriched uranium, a key interest of the United States at the time, only grabbed headlines for about a day or two, and after that, the story was either ignored or the focus tended to turn to the perceived unhelpfulness of Brasilia and Ankara, or towards the perceived vanity of the leaders of Brazil and Turkey at the time. In this period, a few myths emerged about the Tehran Declaration that have rendered, in my assessment, more difficult an accurate understanding of what actually happened at the time. We can talk about the different motivations, whether it was a mistake or not, but there's certain things about what actually happened that I think is important to take into consideration in order to ensure that going forward, perhaps these type of situations could be handled better by all the different parties. One of the first myths is that Brazil and Turkey were tricked and lured into this arrangement by a very, very cunning and clever Iran who managed to bring these two countries rather naively into this arrangement against their own best self-interest and wisdom. I think that is first of all, far too generous assessment of Iranian foreign policy. I don't think they have that capability to begin with. Secondly, also defies the long history of how this whole thing came about. For instance, the meeting that was scheduled by Lula to go to Tehran, which coincided with the climax of the negotiations over the sanctions issue, had already been scheduled in early February, long before there was any clear assessment of exactly when the sanctions issue would be climaxing or not. So what seemed to be a very clever coincidence, and of course not a coincidence, actually in many ways seemed to be something that could not have been planned in that level of detail beforehand. Furthermore, when you take a look, I interviewed a lot of the officials from Turkey and Brazil, and also had access to see some of the internal documents of the foreign ministry there, in which they describe how the negotiations and the whole thing came about. When you take a look at the detail there, you actually do not get the impression that Iran was the more eager party. On the contrary, Iran was at times, of course, looking for independent mediators, and I will address that later on. But this was something that Turkey and Brazil, and particularly Turkey initially after the TRR collapse in November, pursued quite aggressively with the support and strong encouragement by the United States. Secondly, Iran only agreed to this agreement. It was never really serious about it. It was only about forestalling sanctions. That could very well may end up being the case. But even if it was true, for instance, that the Iranians only did this to be able to forestall sanctions, then that does show the potential and occasional success of threatening sanctions compared to the more regular lack of success of imposing sanctions. And if the argument was that this, the sanctions pursuit was aimed at bringing the Iranians back to the table, well, then it may have been even more successful had the sanctions been more used as a threat than an actual imposition. There's also several other reasons why Turkey and Brazil actually was successful that goes beyond the timing of this issue and whatever intentions the Iranians had. This was not something that started just a couple of weeks before the Tehran Declaration. Already since October, November, the Turks had, and in fact already since spring '09, the Turks had shown their interest in mediating between the United States and Iran. The Iranians at first were rather lukewarm to the proposition. Once the TRR deal in November 2009 started to fall apart, both El-Baradei and the United States were quite eager to see what the Turks would be able to do in order to convince the Iranians to agree to the deal. And between November 2009 and May 2010, Turkey and Brazil were involved in far more personal diplomacy with Tehran than the entire P5+1 combined. Davutoglu and Amorim were shuttling in and out of Tehran. Prior to the negotiations on May 17th, 2010, the Turks placed a very, very senior Turkish official in Iran for 2 full weeks to prepare the ground for the negotiations, in which a lot of the initial hurdles for the talks actually were already cleared. Furthermore, the Turks and the Brazilians pursued in their negotiations with Iran a similar approach as they did in the United States, which meant that they did not just go and talk to the foreign ministry in Iran, they did not just go and try to sell this idea to the president's office, but they actually systematically spoke to every power center in Iran that they had access to in order to get maximum buy-in and build the type of trust that is needed in order to be able to get a yes from a very, very suspicious and paranoid Iranian leadership. As one of the diplomats from these countries explained to me, that is exactly the same thing the Turks did here in the United States, knowing very well that any major agreement could not be sold if it was only being discussed with the White House or the State Department, but rather you have to speak to the Congress and specific senators as well in order to get the type of buy-in that is needed for a sustainable yes. And let's not also forget that the final phase was an 18-hour-long, very, very gruesome negotiation that was about to collapse on several occasions. So that shows once again that diplomacy and diplomatic activities, particularly with a government like Iran that is not only paranoid, extremely suspicious about the outside world, but also was faced with intense rivalries and enmity within the government itself, does take a significant amount of diplomacy and patience, and the level of diplomacy and patience that requires political space to be able to pursue it. Political space was probably one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest shortcomings or deficiencies from the U.S. side, and I'll get to that in a second. Tehran Declaration was not a final deal. In some of the commentary in the United States, this has been treated as if this was the final deal, and that in many ways actually would complicate the ability to be able to address the larger nuclear file that Iran and the United States and the P5+1 were discussing. This was not really the case. At the end of the day, the U.S. itself, as well as some of the criticism from its European partners, had question marks about the idea of pursuing the swap as the initial step of diplomacy. There was a lot of benefits. The benefits could have been that if it was successful, political space and time and pressure on the administration would reduce, but there was also the fear that this deal was, at the end of the day, a confidence-building measure and a sideshow. It was never supposed to be the central piece of the negotiations. It ended up becoming the central piece of the negotiations because it was the only confidence-building measure that was pursued. Once there was essentially neither a yes nor a no from the Iranians, the diplomatic track collapsed. As the Brazilians and the Turks pursued this, it was quite clear, in my assessment at least, that this was about bringing the Iranians back into the negotiation track, getting them to get the LEU out of the country, reduce the pressure that existed on the United States, and not have it to be the end of the deal, but rather as the beginning of the diplomacy. Obviously, the spin from Tehran was to try to make it as much as possible as the conclusion of the deal. And I think it was mentioned earlier on here that including the right of enrichment as the first paragraph of the deal definitely was something that made it very, very difficult and complicated matters over here in Washington. And I did address this issue specifically with Amorim as well as with people from the Turkish side. And I think they gave an interesting answer. I'm not saying it was convincing or not, but at the end of the day, this was a deal. The parties of the Tehran Declaration was not the United States or the P5+1. The parties of the declaration was Turkey and Brazil. Turkey and Brazil have a long history of already recognizing Iran's right to enrichment. So there wasn't anything particularly new happening there. All this was meant to do was to get the LEU out of Iran. The United States did not need to be a party to the declaration, just use the declaration in order to make sure that the LEU stockpile was significantly reduced in Iran. Then onto the issue of, did the deal fall because 20% was not addressed, because 1,200 kilos in May 2010 was only 50% of the Iranian stockpile rather than 75% of the Iranian stockpile as it would have been if the deal had been accepted in 2010. These, I think, are extremely important factors that definitely reduces the value of the deal from the United States. The amount of time that the U.S. would gain if 75% of the stockpile was out is incomparable with the amount of time and political space that it could gain from the Tehran Declaration, mindful of the fact that the LEU that would be left in Iran after the Tehran Declaration, had it been accepted, would nevertheless be enough to be able to produce one nuclear bomb. And that was the threshold that the United States was trying to get around. But at the same time, I think to give some credit to the President of the United States, if there's a letter from the President of the United States that specifically calls for 1,200 kilos and does not make a mention of the increased stockpile, does not make a mention of 20%, I think it's difficult to expect that the Brazilians and the Turks, although they did have a very extensive number of meetings with the United States, would not view the letter from the United States President as the final word on what the American position was. Now, when you read some of the WikiLeaks, you do see that there was a lot of contradictions at times, and the U.S. government has a tremendous amount of issues at hand, and at times what General Jones was saying and what some American diplomats were saying to the Turks actually did not match up, and it didn't seem to be anything else but simple mistakes and lack of communication internally in the government. But what I think ultimately created the difficulty for the United States to say yes to this deal, beyond the issue of 20% and 1,200 kilos, beyond the issue of recognizing the right of enrichment, which was very problematic, probably far more so for France than for the United States. is what one of the top negotiators from the U.S. told me, which is that by that time, the administration had simply run out of political space here in Washington. The Obama administration already knew from the very, very beginning that the political space of being able to do something creative to end the 30-year enmity between the United States and Iran, this institutionalized enmity, was very, very limited. And as the Obama administration did a tremendous amount of work in the beginning of '09 to change the atmospherics between the country, knowing very well that there were pressures from Congress, pressures from some of the allies of the United States to put deadlines and timelines on the negotiations, they knew very well that time was of the essence. And the biggest blow to the administration's policy, particularly when it came to being able to get to negotiations fast, was what happened in Iran during the elections. Massive fraud followed by massive human rights abuses that made engagement with an already reprehensive government even more difficult and more reprehensive. That political space that was closed in on the administration left them with very, very little maneuverability, a maneuverability that could permit them to make a deal in October. But by the time it was May 2010, Congress was coming at the administration as a steamroller, threatening that unless there were sanctions in the Security Council, they would go forward with their own unilateral sanctions, sanctions, which would have tremendously negative effects on the U.S.'s relationship, not only with the Europeans because of extraterritorial implementation of the sanctions, but also in the process of having a reset with Russia and handling many of the other relationships. I think that was one of the most critical factors that prevented a more nuanced approach and response, not necessarily a direct yes, but a more nuanced approach towards the declaration. And I think it just goes to show that this rhythm between the United States and Iran, in which unfortunately over the last 30 years, whenever there has been political readiness on the Iranian side, that has not been matched on the American side, and vice versa. When there has been readiness on the American side, that has not been matched by readiness on the Iranian side. And that was, for instance, just a couple of months earlier when the U.S. was ready to move forward, the Iranians were entangled with their own domestic problems, an outright war within the Iranian elite that prevented them from being able to say yes. Now, did you give this to me or you need it back in order to give it to me? Oh, you gave me that one. Okay. I was strategically holding on to it so you couldn't give it to me. Let me just then sum up and say, at the end of the day, Turkey and Brazil, though obviously mistakes have occurred, and I would personally agree with the criticism of embracing, or in the manner in which the Ahmadinejad government was embraced, only months after, and the continuation of mass and human rights abuses in Iran. Nevertheless, right now, in a state in which the policy in the United States is going to increasingly go towards sanctions, and in which fewer and fewer countries who are in a position to take a risk of seeing if perhaps they can help, if they can mediate, they're going to probably be quite discouraged by taking any risks for being able to resolve an issue that the superpowers themselves cannot resolve. It should not be forgotten that there is a level of political cachet that Turkey and Brazil still has in Iran, that incidentally behind the scenes on a few occasions have been used for human rights issues, but much more can be done. But nevertheless, there's very few countries that the Iranians have any confidence or trust in. And obviously, the United States doesn't have much trust in the Iranians either. If there are a few countries that can play that role between the United States and Iran in order to be able to avoid the trajectory that the two countries currently are on, which is either, in the optimistic perspective, a trajectory towards a containment policy that down the road will be successful and will actually not deteriorate into a more open confrontation. Or the more pessimistic view, which is containment at the end of the day is a policy of standing on the brink of war as long as you possibly can. There's not a lot of other countries that have the ability to intervene and find another approach and another way out. So going forward, particularly when we're in the midst of what seems to be a reset between Brazil and the United States, and one can look back and one can point to mistakes, one can look back and point to misunderstandings, I think it would be perhaps too big of a mistake to completely dismiss the utility that Turkey and Brazil can play in order to resolve this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Trita. Turn now to Professor Messari.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this for their kind invitation, in particular Paulo Sotero. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of my thoughts about this topic. My argument here is that we cannot talk about the Arab perspective on the mediation between Iran and the international community without distinguishing, without talking about the importance of the Iranian nuclear program before we can talk about the proper mediation. This is the first part of my arguments. And the second one is that in order to talk about the mediation, we need to distinguish between different Arab countries, and we need to distinguish between the Arab states and what we call the Arab streets. If I have time, I will talk about the future of the NPT in the region, but I doubt I will have time for that. My objective within this today is to fill out all the blanks in this table. So I will start with the importance of the relevance of the Iranian program to Arab states. And here I'm speaking mainly about the Sunni Arab states, mainly Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, eventually Morocco. And why these? Because these countries actually have been speaking over the last few years have been seeing Iran as an increasing threat to their national security. We didn't need WikiLeaks to know that mainly these Arab states see Iran and its nuclear program as a threat, and that they want the U.S. and its allies to act against it and to act soon in order to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. The King of Jordan, King Abdullah of Jordan, has spoke on several occasions about a Shia crescent. The president of Egypt, the former president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, was extremely voiceful against a threat of Shia people in the region. Saudi Arabia is looking at what is taking place right now in Bahrain from the position of feeling that there is an Iranian hand behind it, and suspecting that if things shift in Bahrain, that will represent a threat to its national security. So, and in Morocco in 2009, over 100 Shia Iranians were expelled from Morocco because of proselytizing, because Morocco has been accused, these people and Iran, of trying to convert Moroccan Muslims from Sunni to Shia beliefs. So there is a belief that there is a threat of an Iranian threat, a Shia threat, and these Sunni countries don't see the perspective of Iran having nuclear weapons with very good eyes, and they would rather have this nuclear program stopped immediately. And this is why I put a minus here. So it is definitely seen as a threat. So in this sense, the Sunni Arab states would see the Brazilian-Turkish mediation in the conflicts between Iran and the international community as a negative action, because they believe that it just delays and postpones any incisive action of the U.S. and its allies against the Iranian program. So And in this sense, the Brazilian position is seen as extremely puzzling. I will make my words Monica's words. Brazil was, since the first mandate of President Lula, was trying to approximate itself from the Arab countries. Brazil took several initiatives. All the initiatives Monica mentioned, I would repeat them here. The state visits, the Celso Amorim's visit to the region, Lula's visit to the region, the summit in 2005 in Brasilia between Arab leaders and Latin American leaders, the second summit in Doha, Qatar, also in which Brazil also played a central and key role in order to make this happen, allow this to happen. The harsh condemnation of Brazil of the bombing of Lebanon and then of the bombing of Gaza, the recognition of the Palestinian state under its 1967 borders by Brazil. All these initiatives were taken by Brazil as a sign of approximating itself from the Arab country, from Arab states, and then came this mediation. So Arab states didn't see the point in that, since, as Monica said, also Iran did not represent a major trade partner of Brazil, and so Arab states did not really understand what was behind that initiative. Now I go to the Gulf states, and here I stress the extremely negative impact of the Iranian nuclear program on the Gulf states. As in a recent article, it was said in a recent article in MERIA, the Middle East Review of International Affairs, the Gulf states have, excluding Saudi Arabia from these Gulf states, the Gulf states will be, probably with Turkey, the most badly impacted states with an Iranian nuclear program that would become a weapons program, because they have no doubt they are extremely vulnerable to any military action by Iran, and they can only rely on their allies in the West in order to protect them from any threat coming from Iran, because they cannot protect themselves by any means, and absolutely no military way to protect themselves. So they see the Iranian nuclear program as definitely extremely negative to them. And in this sense, the mediation was seen as extremely positive. Why? Because it allowed them somehow to gain some time. It gave them hope that the Iranian nuclear program would be stopped eventually, and that some peaceful resolution to the conflict, to the issue, would take place. And in this sense, in that moment, it was their only hope for getting rid of an Iranian nuclear program getting weaponized. So now I go to the Arab streets, and here the Iranian nuclear program was seen with extremely positive eyes. If we several opinion polls have showed us that show us consistently that even in Sunni Arab states, Shia leaders are quite popular. Sheikh Nasrallah, after the attacks of Israel against Lebanon, Sheikh Nasrallah was the most popular Arab leaders in several Arab countries. More recently, the Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey is the most popular leader in the region too, even though he is not Arab. So the Arab public opinion does not share this distinction the leaders keep stressing on of splitting Sunnis from Shia. I'm not saying here that Shia and Sunni Muslims don't kill each other. We just look at what is taking place in Pakistan and Iraq to see that they kill do kill each other. What I'm saying here is that in the large public opinion in the Arab world, they don't necessarily reject Shia people for being Shia. They accept, they welcome the leadership of Sheikh Nasrallah, for instance, and they welcome, they see with extremely positive eyes the Iranian nuclear program. And in this sense, the Brazilian-Turkish initiative was an extremely welcome initiative because it's allowed Iran, it would have allowed Iran to get off the hook and to continue with its nuclear program and to continue participating in the international community. So since it was seen as somehow positive, bringing positive solutions to or venues to Iran, it was seen as a positive initiative by the Arab street. And in this sense also, the Brazilian position was extremely welcomed by the Arab street. So yes, I made it. I will be able to talk here about the nuclear, the NPT. The Iranian nuclear program is, if it continues and if Iran gets weapons, nuclear weapons, it will be the beginning of an arms race in the region. Jamal Mubarak, the son of former President Mubarak, when he was getting ready to become the candidate of his party and then the president of Egypt, one of the issues he embraced was, well, we need to revive our nuclear program and we need to work in our nuclear capability. And the message that was sent to the West was, well, we can live with an Israeli, with Israeli nuclear weapons, but with Israeli and Iranian nuclear weapons, that would be hard to accept, and we need to protect ourselves. There is also there are also strong doubts about whether the U.S. would eventually extend its nuclear umbrella to Arab states. Whether if Iran hits, and I would agree with the position that Iran will not use would not have nuclear weapons in order to use them, but for prestige. But Arab states, and mainly Sunni Arab states, see that if Iran gets nuclear weapons and if Iran hits an Arab state with its nuclear capability, the Arab states don't see the U.S. as protecting them and as extending its nuclear umbrella to them and as retaliating against Iran because of that. So Arab states, so this is definitely the case of a nuclear arms race if Iran gets away with its nuclear, with the nuclear weapons program. And in this sense, the Brazilian-Turkish mediation was a positive sign for the future of the nuclear, the NPT, because if and only if it allowed, and here I go to my last slide, if it really allowed Iran to develop its nuclear capability without turning its nuclear program into a weapons program. So if the outcome of the nuclear program would is if the mediation of Turkey and Brazil of the conflict between Iran and the international community has as an outcome allowing Iran to develop a nuclear capability without turning this capability into a weapons program, this would be positive for the future of the nuclear talks in the region and would help avoiding an arms race in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Messari. We'll open it up now for comments and questions. Let me lead off with a question for both, I guess, Trita Parsi and Professor Messari. Trita, in your presentation, you talked about the agreement and said that it would be the first step in a process of confidence building. And as you kind of identified, the concern in Washington was that it might be a kind of a last step. when one looks at, and we've had scholars and programming that Haleh Esfandiari's program has done, has looked at Iran's kind of nuclear intentions and compared it to other cases of countries of proliferation concern. It's not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible in the face of an existential threat. It's sort of deliberate and determined. Could you discuss kind of the U.S. critique of the agreement in terms of the hedge option that it left for Iran, and you know, Iran under Article 4 does have the right to kind of fuel cycle technology, but kind of Article 4 does not negate Article 2, and what are the rights of the outside powers for the transparency of the program, and how this agreement would have left Iran with what from Washington would have seemed an unacceptable hedge option. And for Professor Messari, on this hedge option, kind of what would, in terms of the perceptions and the kind of country, the grid that you have there, how would that be perceived by the regional actors? An Iran that is not a declared nuclear weapon state, Iran that is not weaponized, but which has kind of a hedge option that it could act on if circumstances would warrant. I didn't mean to leave you out, Craig, but...
Sorry, I may chime in.
Okay, please feel free.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think that's a very interesting and important question, and it behooves us to remind ourselves that at the end of the day, the swap deal was an American proposal. Already in the beginning of the administration was looking at various ideas of how can the stockpile of LEU in Iran be significantly reduced, for numerous reasons, for non-proliferation purpose, but also to be able to reduce pressure from Israel, reduce pressure from Congress, to open up the options that the administration would have instead of seeing those options being slimmed down. And at that point, there was already ideas about potentially convincing the Iranians to ship out the LEU to Russia, have it be used for the Boucher reaction. The administration was not aware, did not expect that on June 2nd, 2009, the Iranians would send a letter to the IAEA asking for the IAEA to help them purchase fuel pads for the TRR, the Tehran Research Reactor, which was running out of fuel. That suddenly gave the administration an amazing opportunity, because now the Iranians themselves had initiated an interest, and then devised the idea that instead of the Iranians buying the fuel pads, which they had done about 10, 15 years earlier, the LEU stockpile would be used to create those fuel pads for them. The criticism that existed within the administration as well as from the European states was, on the one hand, would this give an air of legitimacy to Iranian enrichment? There were Security Council resolutions that stated that Iran has to suspend its enrichment activities. Using the LEU that Iran already had enriched, would that give them a level of legitimacy and an acceptance of Iranian enrichment that was necessary for the swap deal, but could inhibit the options of the administration down the road? And that goes then back to when you asked about the hinge. What was the ultimate objective of the United States? Was it still zero enrichment, as it was during the Bush administration, in which the argument was that the best possible way of preventing Iran from gaining any nuclear weapons would be for Iran not to have any enrichment at all? Or was it a recognition that many people in the administration, at least privately, had, that getting the Iranians back to zero was extremely difficult, if not impossible, so the best option is to find a way to create as thick and impenetrable firewall as possible between Iran having the know-how and the Iranians actually having the weapon. I'm of the opinion, of the impression, that the administration had till this day actually not really made up its mind. It has pushed forward that decision, feeling that, A, if they were to publicly adopt the zero enrichment objective, it would make diplomacy as difficult as it was during the Bush years. If they do the opposite, it would be seen potentially as a major concession to the Iranians. It could further embolden them, and would also create tensions within the alliance of the United States and the Europeans. What's interesting with the TRR is that whether it was the Turkish-Brazilian version or whether it was the October deal, that problem still remained. So the key issue of the hedge would not have been resolved by the TRR in October, nor would it have been resolved by the Turkish-Brazilian mediation. The one obvious difference, however, of course, was that the Tehran Declaration accepted Iran's right to enrichment, but as we discussed earlier on, the perspective of the Turks and the Brazilian was that this is their agreement with Iran. The U.S. was not expected to be a signatory of this.
I think that's it. I will follow this distinction between Sunni states in general, Gulf states, except in Saudi Arabia, and then the Arab Street. I think that for the Sunni states, this option would have been better than nothing, but it would have been still negative because Iran would have an edge on the Arab states. Arab states, the region is supposed to be a region free of nuclear weapons and of weapons of mass destruction, to the exception of Israel, but the region is planning on that. So how allowing Iran to have a nuclear program without nuclear weapons would be positive, would not necessarily be a good thing for from the Sunni perspective. From the Gulf states, they're taking anything they you give them. I mean, they're extremely vulnerable. They need, and they see that Iran acquiring nuclear weapons would represent a major threat to them. So they don't. They would not accept. They would accept that as a second best option, but as an okay option. As for the Arab Street, I remember the Operation Desert Storm, and when Saddam Hussein sent missiles on Scud missiles on Israel, and how the Arab Street was jubilant because the Israelis were being hit and were scared the same way the Arabs are scared. I remember the war, the bombing of Lebanon, and the way Hezbollah replied to the bombing by sending Katyusha missiles on Israel and bringing fear to Israelis, and the jubilation of people when they see these retaliations taking place against Israel. In this sense, I think that for the Arab Street, just an edge and not having weapons wouldn't allow Arabs, Muslims in general, and I'm not sure that this is a good way to see it, as an eventual Iranian nuclear weapon as a Muslim bomb. That's certainly not the way the Iranians see it, but I think that for the Arab Street that would not be seen as a positive outcome.
Please, Greg.
Yeah, I just want to note that once the deal was announced in May, probably the single factual point that the U.S. administration stressed most strongly with Brazil and Turkey was this point about the amount of enrichment that had occurred between October and May, that this was all of a sudden a very different agreement than the one that had been bandied about in October. And while it's true, I think that the White House letter seemed ambiguous on that point, there also had been many other channels of communication to make that point clear, that the enrichment that had taken place in October and May was a very important factor in the position that we took. And the other point, as I mentioned earlier, was a concern that, and I don't think it was a surprise to anybody in Washington or elsewhere, that the Iranians took the agreement and sort of cried victory. So our fear about dividing and conquering in the international community turned out to be, I think, justified, except that I think that Turkey and Brazil did address this in their signing up to actually enforce the sanctions, which is a critical factual point as well.
Thanks. Roger Hardy, then we'll go to...
I'm Roger Hardy. I'm a British journalist currently at the Wilson Center. There's a charge kind of hanging in the air, and I'd like to put it to Ambassador Kelly. We've heard it a bit today, and in a fairly muted form, but we've heard it from very weighty figures in this country. I'm thinking of people like Gary Sick on Gulf 2000 and on Sick's website. That essentially the Obama administration was too quick to shift from diplomacy to sanctions. And therefore the charge is that this undermines or calls into question its commitment to diplomacy in the first place.
I think that, having seen this from the inside, I would disagree with that. I think that there was an honest effort, and President Obama paid a certain political price for that honest effort to reach out. He was called naive, an ingenue who had just arrived in Washington, thought he could extend a hand not only to Iran but to Cuba, to Venezuela, and so forth. So he paid a price, but he felt that this is something that he had to do. And I think that the buildup of facts made clear that the only way forward was a combination of diplomacy and pressure. And the fact that we did not ever say to the Turkish or Brazilian governments that you shouldn't be pursuing channels of communication, but that we tried to focus on an assessment of what was the facts on the ground. That was the focus. So I would say no. I don't think we were too quick to. Sure, there are political circumstances in any country, of course, not only the United States but also Brazil, Turkey, France, elsewhere. But I do think that the administration made an honest effort to test the waters for a more dialogue-focused approach.
Let me just add one thing to that. There is the belief among some, I don't think Gary Sick would be included, that this was not a genuine effort from the very beginning and that this was only meant to be able to create greater buy-in into international sanctions. Some of that may have been helped by the fact that one of the arguments for diplomacy was that it actually would help get greater consensus for sanctions if it failed. But I'm not left with the impression that that assessment is correct. On the contrary, I think the administration was quite genuine, very determined in the beginning, but probably a little bit surprised to see the tremendous amount of obstacles that existed to being able to see diplomacy succeed and the amount of time and effort that it would need to take. Problems on the Iranian side, I mentioned with the elections, and you suddenly have in Iran, if you read some of the WikiLeaks and talk to people who were involved at the time, the biggest problem was that the Iranians simply did not seem to be able to make any decisions because of the paralysis that had hit Tehran. But also on the U.S. side and with some of its allies, the very beyond strong skepticism that was aired by some of the U.S.'s allies when it came to pursuing this approach. And the fact that at the end of the day, the U.S.-Iran relationship is not just an ordinary enmity of 30 years. It's an institution. There are careers that have been built on its back. You cannot change this very quickly. And the administration at the end of the day did not even have enough time under the best of circumstances. But almost everything that could have gone wrong prior to the beginning of the negotiations, things that were outside of the control of the administration, actually did go wrong and made the starting point for the administration extremely difficult.
I would substantially agree with what the previous comments. I think the key difference between Obama and the Bush administration, and just as there was a reset with Russia, I think there's a reset in terms of the U.S. policies towards kind of adversarial countries that President Obama has referred to as outlier states. I think the Bush administration had an unresolved contradiction that started in the first administration and sort of plagued its diplomacy in the second administration, which was what was the U.S. said famously, administration officials, all options are on the table, but to achieve what? The Bush administration never made it clear that whether the objective was to overturn the regime or to change its conduct. I think the Obama administration came in and made it clear, and if you look at the National Security Strategy document, where the consistent theme is we're offering these countries a choice, a structured choice. I think Obama administration, there has been a credible reset in that respect in terms of clarifying the objective, that the United States would, as one U.S. diplomat put it, take yes for an answer. But with Iran, where the nuclear question is sort of so much a function of Iranian domestic politics, and again, Haleh's meetings has brought that, really kind of elucidated that in a really powerful way. One questions the nuclear question is a function of the domestic politics, and at the core of that is relations with the United States and Iranian domestic politics. Another official said, and I think this is true, that Iran does not respond to pressure, but without pressure it does not respond. And so I think that the linkage of diplomacy and with the punitive measures is part of a strategy where the administration has made clear that it would take yes for an answer. And if anything, there's criticism of the Obama administration in the light of kind of the intractability of the problem. One conservative figure said, will Obama take no for an answer? And that's sort of where I think the U.S. domestic politics on Iran is. Turn to this gentleman here, microphone coming to you, and then Michael Adler in the back.
Thank you. Kadiristan from Seta Foundation. Ambassador Kelly mentioned the alliance, the U.S. concern about dividing the alliance. Russia and China agreed to those sanctions, specific sanctions, and sanctions, those specific sanctions only. And during the whole process, they also made statements kind of criticizing the unilateral approach and emphasizing diplomacy while they did that. And U.S. official policy was also dual-track policy. So my question is, what would stop the U.S. administration from saying that, okay, this is not a deal we signed, and there are problems in it, but they could have downplayed that enrichment rights section, which U.S. did not sign itself anyway. It was a deal between Turkey and Brazil and Iran. It could have said, okay, we pursue the sanctions, but this is a sort of step towards diplomatic solution. Let's see what they do, but rather they opted for rejection, saying that the deal didn't satisfy their the initial requirements of the initial deal. Thank you.
I guess since I'm no longer officially a diplomat, I can't escape in the formula that we don't answer theoretical questions. So I guess I have to answer that. I do think the answer is in the same answer I gave before about enrichment that took place between October and May. And that was, your question would have been a very pertinent one in October, but I think by May, I don't think we should ever underestimate how facts on the ground or our perception of facts on the ground were driving this. Yes, politics, the relations with Russia and China all were part of it, but also the facts on the ground were, I think, the major consideration. And also, with respect to Russia and China, yes, this was a very fragile coalition, and that's why I think there was some nervousness about the effect of what clearly the Iranians wanted to use to get away from the P5 plus one approach.
Okay. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. You made references at least twice to this difference of the amount of law enrichment between October and May. We know that, but at least, didn't President Obama know on April 20th the amount of low enrichment accumulated in Iran? Even I knew that from the website of ISIS as to how much low enriched uranium. So, yes, there is a difference between 1,200 kilograms that was in October, and in May that was something like 2,400 kilograms. But when he wrote that letter on April 20th, he made reference to 1,200 kilograms. So didn't he know about the amount of low-enriched uranium accumulated in Iran?
Well, there have been a lot of comments made in the last year about whether that component should have been in the letter. I'm not going to get into the drafting of a letter in the White House, which is a complicated process. But there is no question that that point was made in other channels as well, even if it didn't appear in the letter. So,
Michael Adler, and he may have a comment on that last exchange.
Michael Adler from the Wilson Center. Actually, my question was on that. I was asking Ambassador, could you tell us how the misunderstanding took place, if it was made clear in other channels, and if there was a letter that said something else which the Turks and the Brazilians took as a mandate for their mission? Could you perhaps explain to us how the misunderstanding occurred? Was there misunderstanding? And why the deal ended up the way it did?
Well, the discussions that took place afterwards, I mean, I think we did recognize that if you only looked at the letter, you would have a different perception of this issue than if you understood the broader context, which is why we talked to both countries and as this began to come out, also, talked somewhat to the press about this, that the letter was, and now the WikiLeaks, of course, have shed somewhat more light on this, but that there were other channels. So yes, I think it's true that the letter taken on its own creates a certain confusion, but this is why we underscored that there were many other forms of communication that did make clear the concern about the enrichment that had taken place.
But if that's true, then how come what happened in Tehran in May, did the Turks and the Brazilians ignore these other briefings? Or was there an effort by the Turks and Brazilians to, even if they understood it, to go ahead and get something on the table so that there could be progress? Or were the Turks and Brazilians spun and manipulated by the Iranians and they came out with a bad document?
I can only guess, because I put myself in the shoes of the Brazilians and the Turks. I would guess the former, that they thought this was a step forward, and we never questioned their good faith. We just had a difference of interpretation about the facts. But I would say it was the former. But I should let the others speak on to that point.
Any other comments or questions? Haleh Esfandiari. Hi, Haleh, you got a microphone right there.
Question for Trita. You said the Iranians were not very keen to begin with to have the Brazilian and the Turks involved, or any kind of involvement, And we also know that Ayatollah Khamenei is very suspicious of all these foreign intervention, especially agreeing to a deal with the United States. How did whoever in Iran was doing the negotiation with the Turks and the Brazilian, and on what base? How did they sell it to Ayatollah Khamenei? And did they tell him that the Americans were on board, the P5+1 were on board, and then the Americans turned it down? So can you talk a little bit about that internal, process in Iran?
Thank you, Haleh. It's a very interesting question. Let me just first say, I did not intend to say that the Iranians were not keen, but looking at some of the internal documents, you were left with the impression that the Brazilians and the Turks were more eager than the Iranians initially. And then once the process started, it ended up becoming quite a mutual process. I think as to the question of who convinced Khamenei, I think there's from two different sides. On the one hand, obviously, the other individuals within the Iranian government, and I think probably most importantly, or at least one of the more important ones, was Salehi, who had argued strongly in favor of the TRR already back in October. But it was also the fact that it was being argued for not only by the Iranian negotiators, but also directly by the Egyptians, the Brazilians, and the Turks in their meetings with the different power centers in Iran. It was not the usual situation in which Khamenei had the ability to distance himself from all of the deals, send a sacrificable diplomat over there to negotiate something, and if it ended up being something that down the road was negative for Khamenei, he could distance himself from it. This was not the case. The meetings was taking place in Tehran. Contrary to what happened in October, the Majlis and key individuals there were briefed on the developments in the negotiations from the very beginning. There were, and you could also see the outcome of that in the sense that in October, the many enemies of Ahmadinejad were doing quite a lot to try to not necessarily undermine the deal as much as making it as costly as possible for Ahmadinejad to accept the deal. Whereas, and they had very good reasons to do so, mindful of the things that Ahmadinejad had done internally. But by 2010, it wasn't just an Ahmadinejad deal. Other elements of the government were involved. And at the result of it, you also see that not only other conservatives came in favor of it, a large portion of the members of the parliament signed a resolution or a statement very quickly in support of it, but also many people from the Green movement came out in support of it. And part of the reason for that, incidentally, at least as it was told to me in some of my interviews with them was that they had realized that this nuclear issue had to be dealt with and be put aside because the entire focus of the international community was on the nuclear issue at the expense of the human rights situation inside of the country. Whereas many of the Greens did not want to see, at least at that point, endorsements from the United States or things of that nature, they were nevertheless taken aback by what they perceived to be an unjustified silence when it came to human rights violations. And part of the reason for that was because of the conflict within the U.S. government on what would be the priority. And if there was a very aggressive tone on human rights, how would that affect America's capital in being able to get a yes from many different Security Council countries for sanctions on Iran on the nuclear file?
In the absence of any additional questions, we're going to adjourn leave it there. We've had a rich kind of morning of discussion looking at the Iran nuclear question and the diplomatic role played by Brazil and Turkey in addressing the nuclear challenge posed by Iran. And we've just heard from this panel on Iranian perspectives as well as those from neighboring states and the United States. So we'll leave it there. There will be a meeting report in due course, but would like to thank the panel for their excellent presentations. I'd like to thank all of you for your participation in today's event, and we are adjourned. Thank you.